Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me here. So we have a small agenda that we're going to do today, and here's the topics we're going to be covering. So really we're going to talk about the concept that no one's immune to this problem that we're having. As Tony mentioned, we're spending millions and even in the case of billions of dollars on software in an attempt to protect ourselves, and yet it's still not working. So how do we do that, right? So we're going to talk about the weakest link. We're going to talk about how that link correlates into the impacts that we're seeing today. And then how do we train our staff within the ministries, within the different departments, to help be the front line in that fight against the cyber attacks. And then finally, how to keep current. So it's a boxing picture. It has nothing to do with cybersecurity, right? Or does it? Mike Tyson famously said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. And that's very cognizant of what happens in our ministries today, or our departments. You think about that, we create the best laid plans, and then one cyber event happens to our organization, and then it falls apart. And so to that event, like we've seen multiple different cases around the world where companies who you would think who are well prepared would be able to defend cyber attacks, but yet they weren't. So while there's lots of companies here, I also added one government, and it's important, Tony and I both being Canadians, there's an organization called the National Research Council of Canada. You probably don't know what they do, but what they do is they focus on providing all the means for Canadian businesses like our own who are in the cyber event where we're potentially helping create products and solutions for the market. They help us define our research. In some cases, they give us funding for our research, and they provide all kinds of supportive stuff. In that activity, like we submit a lot of IP information to the NRC, and they store that information. About 2 years ago, they got compromised, what they're willing to say is, by a Chinese organization. So this is just a clear-cut example of what's going on where foreign governments are targeting other foreign governments to get threat intel, in this case IP intel, on what's going on research. And not just cybersecurity research, NRC covers the entire gamut of every product that's kind of created in Canada, from things that we do in oil and gas to things that we might do in healthcare. That entire library of information is stored under the umbrella of the NRC that was compromised. The Canadian government to this day still hasn't stated what the extent of that compromise is. The only impact or the only notification we ever got was a letter from the government saying we were implicated, and that was it. No follow-up, no nothing. So think about the user. We know the information that we gave to the government. We have no idea who has hold of it right now. So do people actually have our project information? So it's something to think about, okay? So the weakest link. So my first point is not meant to be demeaning. So as humans, by the nature of who we are, we always try to take the easiest path. So we're a bit lazy in that way. We want the easiest way to do things. We want the quickest way to do things. And because of that, that causes us to skip a couple steps that people in the cyber community who are on the other side have started to realize they could take advantage of that. So things like USB keys. So we all have USB keys. We all exchange USB keys, okay? There was several organizations, and we've done this before in some of the exercises, where if we're gonna target a company, what we do is we go into the building or the surrounding buildings where a company operates, and we put a compromised USB stick with some interesting information, like say for example, research project. We label it, and we leave them all over the place. We leave them in the lobby, we leave them in the washrooms, We leave them on the counters. Every person who comes by will see it and go, hey, it's a free USB stick. And they put it in their pocket. And then what do you think they do next? 9 times out of 10, they're going to go to their desk and they're going to put it into their computer. The second they put that into their computer, we have a backdoor into their network. Because what they don't know is we can put some fake files in there, but we can also put a piece of code that basically goes into their firewall on their desktop, opens up a port, and says anything coming in through this connection is allowed. At that point, I can turn on your camera, I can turn on your microphone on your laptop, because most laptops and most computers have those built in today. And now I can listen to you, and I can watch you, and I can gather intel. So think about this. If you're working in the finance ministry, the information that you get. But now, if you're in the defense ministry, what do you get? Now you're putting your country at danger because you're potentially giving out intel to a foreign state. Because me, the person who's collecting that information, I could potentially have a buyer over here that's willing to pay me tens of millions of dollars for that information. So my ability to collect that information becomes quite easy. I also put chocolate here. And I don't know how popular chocolate is in the state of Kuwait, but in North America, chocolate, people love chocolate. People love chocolate so much, there was a research project where this one company, and this was all set up and agreed to by the company, by the way, I'm just going to quantify that. And what they did was they set up a little booth outside the company. And what they did was they offered those who came to the booth free chocolate if they gave their password. Their user account and password for free chocolate. And 9 out of 10 people who showed up to the booth gave up their password for chocolate. Right? So think about that. We're willing to give up our password for chocolate. And so what I think there is this issue that we don't understand, that the impact of releasing our account and our password that it's going to have on our ministry, on our job, and to our government, and also to our country. Because if the information that I hold in my day-to-day job, if someone gets hold of that, how can they potentially use that against me? Okay? Other things that people do is they download software. Most people, if they're looking to try to do something, and they want a piece of software to do it, they're typically going to do a Google search. They're going to find a free piece of software that does it. They're going to download it. And we're going to fully trust that who is giving us that software is a trustable source, and it doesn't have any malware on it. Now, malware comes in 2 forms, okay? Malware comes in the stuff that our antivirus is going to detect, but then there's other software that basically has what's called a backdoor. And what the backdoor means is it sits there dormant until the opportunity exists to send information. And so what we do is when you can embed that software into something, you would never know. And you would never see the transaction of that happening. You would never know it happened. However, there is traces that basically that gathering of information is being sent out. That's where that gets dangerous. The other thing that's also changed in the last 20 years is our lives being connected. If you say look at your lives 10 or 15 years ago, we did not have the influx of mobile driving a lot of what we do. Every single person in this room has at least one mobile device. Quite a few have 2. You probably have at least 1 laptop, a home computer, and a tablet. And you put all your personal information on it. And not only that, you'll also put your work information on it. So if I can get into your device, whether it's a mobile, a laptop, or anything else, I get access to that information. Social engineering. This is just a quick example of just really a phishing example. So in this case, we're targeting someone very specific. In this case, what we're trying to do is we found someone in the department that we know is basically going to have a certain amount of access to information. And we know enough, because of our intelligence, that if we send them something, they might respond to us right away because, again, they're in a rush. So what we did was we sent this person a transaction with an approval. We just need this manager to send us the approval. So as we know, a lot of managers and directors are busy people. They're going to see the email come up, potentially on their phone, and what they're going to do is they're going to go, oh yeah, this is coming in, I'm expecting this, I'm going to just click on the approval. So when this person opens that file has what's called malicious payload in it. And it installs a backdoor again, or a piece of malware onto that device. And once they do that, we're into that device. We can monitor that device. We can collect the data from it. We can turn on the microphone. We can turn on the camera. Okay? So the impact, so I talked a bit about some of these, but here there are. So there's something called a keylogger. So when they install that piece of software, whether it's from the free software or the file I clicked on in an email, there's something called a keylogger. And what is a keylogger? Well, we all type into keyboards, right? So really all it is it logs everything you type into your keyboard. Okay? It could be to a file, or it could be to what's called a buffer. And then once that buffer, that file gets filled, it basically packages it up and it sends it to a server. That's it. So every time you type in a user account and password, it's recorded. It's sent to someone. Okay? Then there's something called a rootkit. Now, a rootkit is a bit more ugly. So a rootkit basically installs itself into your operating system. So if you're using a computer, you're probably using, say, Windows. Windows is your operating system. So a rootkit embeds itself into the operating system. And what it does at that point is it can do whatever it wants. So all of your network activity, and even network activity that doesn't even necessarily belong to you, can be captured and forwarded. All of your activity can then be forwarded, including, again, your microphone, your keystrokes, and your video. And this is not science, this isn't movies, this happens all the time. We've seen it time and time again. If you've seen, there's a famous picture of Mark Zuckerberg on his computer, and if you look at his computer, you actually will see that there's tape over his cameras on his desktop computers. And so those are just the kind of mechanisms you put in place to make sure if someone ever gets in, they can't record. It's a simple, like what? It's not even worth like a penny, pretty much, a little slab of tape covered over the video, right? The video camera. But it does, it fixes the problem, right? Because that's the threat. The threat is having that captured. Because if you can capture Mark Zuckerberg's conversations in his office, think about the value of that, potentially to the financial markets, to projects they're working on, to their competitors. Someone is going to buy that. Okay? Specific to the agency, this is where it gets really, really contentious. Because now, within the realm of our government, think about a foreign government having that intel on your government. Think about if you're in a position of military activity and you're giving up the position of your troops, right? Or someone, a foreign state, knows your financial position, that the company isn't, or the country isn't as the state that they think it is. So what can that country potentially do to create upheaval in that other state? Those are all things that are a ramification of this information getting out. So that's why it's very important to think about protecting it. So train to address the risk. So training is a big part of it. And there's multiple different ways you can do this. It's not necessarily just one of having someone sit in a class, although that is one piece. There's also the piece that your ministries are going to have to create policies and procedures to show you what the acceptable use of devices are, for example. So if you bring in your mobile device, it could be your personal mobile device, but what are you allowed to do with it? Okay? If you are issued a device by your ministry or your agency, what are your expected uses of that? Likewise, if you're issued a computer, like a laptop computer or a tablet, what are the expected uses of that in that environment? Both if you're in the office and potentially if you have to take your computer home and do work. So if you have to travel with it, what does that mean? Right? And likewise, they're going to have to also create the policies and procedures about the software that they're going to put in place to help mitigate those risks and hopefully identify if you're being targeted or if you've been compromised. It's very key. So specific around how to address some of this, when you look at the 3 levels that we're talking about here, staff has a different level of training because staff is the front line to your defense. So if, for example, I train you that if you see that free USB sitting somewhere, don't pick it up. Just don't pick it up. If you want a free USB, I'll give you USB, but don't pick up a free USB. Because even USBs that you get at trade shows, there was a trade show in the US that they actually had malware, and these came right out of a factory. Okay, right out of a factory, that were used in the trade show, had malware on them. They had a rootkit on them. So we're finding that even being able to compromise companies who do manufacturing is a mechanism being used to get into networks today. That's how ugly it's getting, unfortunately. Executives have the biggest role in the success in this program, because they are the leaders. And what the leaders say is what we should do. So the leaders have to believe in the program, and they have to be the ones who basically create that voice of the program. Without that, you're not going to be successful. You have to show and set by example, and that's a key to the success. And this is one of the things we really try to elaborate on with any program that we get into. And then finally, the technical staff. The technical staff need a different level of training because they are the system implementers. So they need to make sure when they're implementing new systems, and this can be the server staff, or it could be the networking staff, it could be even the developers, the software developers, to make sure they understand how to design and build a system that's secure. Because it is going to be under attack. How is it going to withstand that? Okay? In our talk this afternoon, we get into a bit more detail on some of the things that are used to do that. And then finally is to make administrators realize they're not above the law, that they still hold a right to the agency for the ministry that they work for. And finally, here's some closing thoughts on the topic. The key element to being successful in the cybersecurity world is creating that whole culture of cybersecurity, making sure each person in the organization knows the level of criticality, the data they handle, what they need to do to protect it, and what the responsibilities are. Okay? That comes through training, that comes through policies, procedures, and that comes through reinforcing the good behavior. I'm not saying you fire every person who does something bad. I'm saying use it as an opportunity to train the rest of your staff to what the good behavior is. Okay? With the changing landscape, you also need to understand from a risk perspective, what does that mean to your organization? So IoT would be a clear-cut example where we're finding in a lot of organizations, staff are buying all kinds of IoT devices, and they find them convenient, they find them cool, they want to use them, and we agree 100%, like there's a lot of stuff. But when they're used to attack the network, then you have to think about that. So we found one network that we were working in, someone actually had a remote toaster. And they had a remote toaster because they wanted toast when they walked into the office in the morning. So they would set up the bread in the toaster at night, and with the proximity system, it knew when they pulled into the company parking lot. And so the toast would be pulled down and start to cook, or to start to brown. But what they didn't realize was that embedded in that little fancy toaster was a wireless interface and a Bluetooth interface. And it was connected to the network. So there was an implicit trust of that device to the network. So from the parking lot, we could actually hack the toaster and use the toaster to get into their network. Right? The person who did this never even thought about this. All they wanted was toast in the morning. But again, this is the stuff we don't think about. So understanding the assets at risk. So for every single department, those assets are going to be completely different. So you have to understand through a process of doing what's called a risk assessment, what those assets are, and then what are the protections you need to put in place to protect that data. Because data in different departments will have different levels of protection assigned to it. So you don't need to spend a ton of money putting a lot of protections where it might not necessarily be needed. You're obviously going to be spending more in, say, military or defense, those kind of departments, to protect yourselves. Okay? And then when you're deploying new technologies, we've seen like over the last few days, lots of new technologies, and you're training your staff for deployment of, say, cloud technologies. Make sure you're including the cybersecurity element of that, making sure they understand how to securely configure those things, how to securely operate those things, and securely access those things. It's a key element to your success. And then finally, leaving and building a SOC to basically drive how you do incident handling within your organization. The SOC should be where all of this threat intel goes, or I should say, the attack intel goes to be processed and then alerted to the senior members of staff to process those attacks accordingly. So they know what's going on. And so then what happens is that correlates into further training that, for example, it could be just start off as a notification to the staff members that we're seeing an increased threat of a specific attack. So that could be a website, for example. So if you're using this website right now, we would just ask you to stop, or we're going to block it, for example, or we're going to temporarily block this because we know it has been compromised, those kind of things. So you can quickly get those messages out to your staff to indicate where those threats are. All right? And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
نشكر السيد فؤاد خان والسيد توني كانجريبالي من ريد كاناري على ما قدموا من موضوع مهم. ونأجل الأسئلة إلى وقت المناقشة العامة after the session. Thank you, Mr. Faud.